The headlines, this is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. Venezuela has announced 7 days of mourning for its president, Hugo Chávez, who has died at the age of 58. Chávez died after a 2-year battle with cancer that was first detected in his pelvis in June of 2011. He had suffered multiple complications following his latest operation in Cuba on December 11th and had not been seen in public since then. News of Chávez's death was delivered Tuesday in an emotional address by Vice President Nicolás Maduro.
We accompanied his daughters, his brother, his family members, and we received the hardest and the most tragic of news that we will ever transmit to our people. At 4:25 in the afternoon today, the 5th of March, Comandante President Hugo Chávez Frias died.
Hugo Chávez's body will be taken in a procession to the military academy in Caracas, where it will lie in state until his funeral on Friday. Venezuela's schools and universities have been shut for the week. Vice President Maduro will assume the presidency until an election is called within 30 days. Foreign Minister Elias Haua told state television that Maduro would also be the candidate of Chávez's governing United Socialist Party.
El presidente leyó correctamente la Constitución el 8 de diciembre en la última.
The president read the Constitution correctly on December 8th during his last public speech that he was able to give, and it is clearly established what will follow and what we always defended. He is gone now, and the vice president assumes power, and we hold elections in the next 30 days. That's the mandate that Hugo Chávez issued last December 8th, and he asked all of his Bolivarian revolutionaries to accompany Nicolás Maduro in this task, and that is what we are going to do.
Meanwhile, Venezuelan opposition leader Enrique Capriles, who was defeated by Chávez last October, offered his condolences to the president's family and called for unity as the nation mourns.
To the government, who are burdened with the principal responsibility of guaranteeing coexistence in freedom and in peace, we hope, like all Venezuelans do, that they act in strict accordance with their constitutional duties, and our national armed forces should remain for all, because they belong to everyone, as it is in the Constitution in its proud history.
Leaders from around the world sent their condolences to the Chávez family. Some allies, like Ecuador, called for national days of mourning in their own country. This is Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff and Peruvian President Ollanta Humala. But first, this is Bolivian President Evo Morales remembering Chávez.
Que luchó por su patria, por la patria grande como Simón Bolívar.
He fought for his country, for the great nation, like Simón Bolívar, a friend who gave his entire life for the liberation of the Venezuelan people, the people of Latin America, and all anti-imperialists and anti-capitalists of the world.
On many occasions, the Brazilian government did not completely agree with President Hugo Chávez. But today, as always, we must recognize that he was a great leader, an irreparable loss, and above all, a friend of Brazil, a friend of the Brazilian people.
To the Venezuelan people, we wish to express our unity of reflection and our hope that things can progress in a passive manner with the cause of democracy in mind. We want to express our solidarity with the Venezuelan people, with the family of our friend, President Hugo Chávez Frias.
The presidents of Peru, Bolivia, and Brazil. Here in the United States, President Obama called Chávez's passing a challenging time for Venezuela. This comes as Vice President Maduro of Venezuela announced Tuesday he is expelling a U.S. Embassy military attaché, accusing him of spying on the Venezuelan military and meeting with right-wing military officers in a plan to destabilize Venezuela. Maduro also said a scientific commission would look into Chávez's death death and the possibility his historical enemies had somehow induced his cancer. Well, today we host a roundtable to look at the life of Hugo Chávez, his legacy, and what may come next for Venezuela. We'll begin in California, where we're joined by Miguel Tinker-Salas, professor at Pomona College of Claremont, California, author of The Enduring Legacy, Oil, Culture, and Society in Venezuela, and the forthcoming Venezuela, What Everyone Needs to Know. Your response to the death of Venezuelan President Hugo Chávez?
Good morning. I think it's a tremendous loss for Venezuela and a loss for Latin America, and as an advocate for South-South relationships. Just recall where Venezuela was in 1998. It had no real presence on the international stage. It had an oil-producing country that had 60% people living in poverty. Today, that has dramatically changed. Poverty has been reduced significantly within Venezuela, and you have a new sense, a new empowerment, a new feeling, and a new sentiment, not only within Venezuela, but within Latin America as a whole, and as an advocate of South-South relationships. And I think that even in death, he will continue to be an important symbol for the very policies he advocated in life, and for the integration of Latin America and its new role on the international stage.
And I'd like to also welcome Eva Goldinger. She has been well known as an American lawyer who has worked with the Venezuelan government and was close to President Chávez. Your reaction on this day after his death?
Well, it's incredibly sad, of course. It's a tremendous tragedy for Venezuela, for people of Venezuela, for people of Latin America. I would say also for people around the world who fight for social justice. Chávez was a champion for the poor, for social justice, against imperialism, against aggression, against war. He's someone who has left an extraordinary legacy, not just in his own country, I think, but around the world. It's an unbelievable tragedy that someone so young, with so much energy, with so much charisma, and with so much determination to continue building his great country and this concept of La Patria Grande, the great homeland in Latin America, would leave us so soon. So I think that Venezuelans and peoples around the world are going to mourn seriously his loss. From two Venezuelan Americans, we go to Greg Grandin, also in our New York studio, currently a Coleman Fellow at the New York Public Library, author of Empire's Workshop, Latin America, the United States, and the Rise of New Imperialism. His most recent book, Fordlandia, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in History. His new book is called Empire of Necessity. It'll be published later this year. Greg Grandin, talk about who Hugo Chávez was. Give us a little short history of his life.
Well, in many ways, if you look at how his life tracks the history of Latin America, it's quite amazing. He was born a few days after the 1954 coup in Guatemala that drove Jacobo Arbenz from power. And that coup, in many ways, culminated the subordination of Latin America to the United States in the Cold War.
Because the U.S. was involved.
The U.S. led that coup, yeah, and that happened in a few days. And his life pretty much ran the whole trajectory from that moment forward of U.S. power in Latin America. It saw the rise and extension of U.S.-backed militarism throughout the region. Venezuela, a little bit less than some of the other more homicidal anti-communist countries, but nonetheless, Venezuela was closely allied to the United States during the Cold War. He came of age under a political regime that was often held up as a little United States, in which two ideologically indistinguishable parties traded power back and forth between 1958-59 up through the 1990s, and then he died, and Latin America has largely led this remarkable movement for independence that he helped broker. When he came to power elected in 1998, when you think about it, the whole region was governed by neoliberals, or pretty much allies and executors of the Washington Consensus neoliberalism, and he was the first person that began to challenge that in power. Lula in Brazil, Luis Ignacio Lula da Silva was elected in 2002, Nestor Kirchner in 2002, Evo Morales a few years later, Rafael Correa in Ecuador. But it really was, in some ways, Chávez that led that remarkable, incredible movement that's world historical. It's unprecedented.
And one point I made in my column in the Daily News today on Chávez is that to the degree that he was seen by the United States and Europe as the most radical of Latin American leaders, he created space for an enormous diversity of other left-oriented leaders that seemed almost more acceptable to the West up against the figure, the lightning rod figure of Chávez.
Yeah, for a long time, Washington policymakers and opinion makers were trying to create this idea that there were two lefts, a good left and a bad left in Latin America, a vegetarian left and a carnivore left. And the kind of emblematic leaders of that was Lula in Brazil, reformist, administered within the institutions of law, and Chávez, fiery populist is a word, a description that I'm sure has been used kind of like Mad Libs and in obituaries of Chávez. But in reality, they actually worked together very, very nicely. I mean, if you read the WikiLeaks cables, the U.S. was constantly trying to push this notion of a division or a divide between Brazil and Venezuela, and Brazil constantly rebuffed it. And certainly Chávez's more flamboyant style on the world stage created a much more willingness to work with so-called more moderate reformers like Lula. And I would argue that their differences had more to do with the political structures that they inherited than anything. And I think they both, in very real ways, had exactly the same goal.
We're going to go to break and continue this roundtable discussion, and also bring you clips of our exclusive discussions with President Hugo Chávez, as well as the Vice President, Nicolás Maduro, who will run for president in this next 30 days. And the question is, where will Venezuela go? This is Democracy Now! We'll be back in a minute. Thanks so much for watching this report from Democracy Now!, your daily independent global news hour. We don't accept advertising or corporate funding, but rather rely on donations from viewers like you. Please make your contribution by visiting democracynow.org. We need your support today to keep bringing you this hard-hitting, in-depth reporting.